You probably noticed that the title, Economics Matters, is kind of a dual meaning, like the Fed has a dual mandate. And I think what I'm going to discuss follows nicely on what Betsy Stevenson just discussed about how we make economics more relevant. We're calling our textbook Economics Matters because we think economics matters for people's lives. It's not just about the subject matter of economics, but it's because economics matters so deeply for the decisions that people are going to make. I've been working on this book now for several years. It was interrupted a little bit when I went to the Treasury Department in the middle of the financial crisis, and then when I went back to serve as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And I'm working together with John Shea, who I worked with at the Treasury Department. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Economic Policy and is a professor at University of Maryland, and Steve Wu, who was a PhD student of mine at Princeton and teaches at Hamilton College. And it's been a really nice collaboration because we see all kinds of students. We teach at a wide range of schools. We have different backgrounds, different fields. And I think we're all pretty unified on our goal that we want to teach economics the way that economics is practiced. We want to make economics relevant for students in a number of respects. We want them to see what modern economists do. And the field of economics has changed rather dramatically since I took introductory economics. For example, if you look at the American Economic Review today versus 35 years ago, the number of quantitative empirical papers using data, has soared. The field has changed rather dramatically. Another way in which the field has changed is behavioral economics, because all of the data that we've been looking at suggests that starting from first principles and assuming rationality and then trying to back out people's preferences and their demand curves and so on doesn't really accord with the way they're making decisions. There are lots of inconsistencies. There are lots of systematic biases, which gave birth to the whole field of behavioral economics, which marries psychological decision-making together with economics, and I think enriches the field. So what we've been trying to do is to be very hands-on the way we write this textbook, where the students are put in the position of decision makers, and I'll say more about how we try to achieve that. Also, to use lots and lots of data and make the data approachable. And one of the things which has really struck me as I've been working on this project is how it is possible to do this without much math, really without any math. How it's possible to do it in plain English without technical jargon. So what I thought I would do is just give you a very quick overview of the book and then highlight a couple of the most distinctive chapters on behavioral economics and on evidence, how evidence is used in economics, and then talk about macroeconomics, which has also changed over the course of my career, and certainly we've learned lots of lessons from the financial crisis, which affects the way I think the profession thinks about macroeconomics and certainly affects the way that policymakers approach macroeconomics. So you probably have a little trouble reading this outline, but it kind of starts with the standard fare, talking about rational decision-making, choices, trade-offs, gains from trade, introduction to supply and demand at a very basic level. Then the next section pushes supply and demand further, talks about it's not only that the curves slope down or up, it's the responsiveness, magnitudes matter. Economics can at best tell us directions of effects for making important decisions in business or policy or in people's lives. They need to know how important something is. They need to know magnitudes. So we discuss elasticity in that context, and I'll come back to that when I talk about evidence, market efficiency and equity. Then we discuss market failure. And I did the same thing in my high school economics textbook. When I discuss how private markets fail, I also did discuss how government fails. My view, neither is perfect. And I think we're setting up kind of a false choice if we think about even something as basic as pollution, where there's clearly a market failure, government doesn't necessarily get the prices right. I lived through cap and trade, bill that passed the House. There were lots of problems with cap and trade system that the Congress devised. I think it would have reduced emissions of CO2, and in the end, I think it was probably an improvement, but it certainly was not a perfect bill. So we discussed reasons for government failure, such as rent seeking. Then standard material on market structure, competitiveness. And then we introduce really two sets of important new tools, I would say, to the principles class. And important not only for public policy, which is a theme running throughout our book, how economics is used in public policy decisions, but also in personal decisions, both individual businesses, organizations that people might be part of. So behavioral economics, which I'll describe in more detail soon, and how evidence matters in economics. Then, with those tools, you could do a lot more in the rest of the book. If students understand how evidence is used in economics, how to interpret evidence, then you can greatly enrich the subsequent material. And that's what we try to do in the chapter on public economics, labor economics, international trade. And international trade, which is such a hot topic now, is placed right after labor economics because the way that trade is being discussed is how does trade affect jobs and wages. That's not obviously the only impact of trade, but that's why we put it right there. Then earnings inequality, health insurance, health economics, where there's lots of new material to talk about with the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Then macroeconomics. The macroeconomic split will also include the chapter on evidence matters, and the way that chapter is written, as you'll see soon, I think appeals to both microeconomics and macroeconomics and enriches both. So I'll say more about macroeconomics towards the end. We have devoted a huge amount of attention to the feature set. I think we finally have it nailed down. I'm glad to see Tom shaking his head. And I just thought I'd kind of describe this to you briefly. We call them watches. We start with data watch. If you're a close reader of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, that might sound familiar. I started a data watch column in the Journal of Economic Perspectives when I was the editor, which was to point out important new data sets that were becoming available, or changes to data sets, like the redesign of the current population survey back in 1994. The census is an obvious one, national income and product accounts. So data watch, and it fits in quite naturally, actually, in most of the chapters, we could have a box pointing to some data about interesting phenomena that the students should be able to, should be aware about, could even access. And with the emphasis on big data, I think this is timely, and I'll come back to that a little bit shortly. History watch. Nice thing about history is it doesn't get dated. So we draw on lessons from history. I think this works particularly well in the macro section of the book, but I think it works well in micro as well. Policy watch. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of all of these in a moment, where we highlight important, relevant policies that fit in with the chapter to make sure the students realize how this is connected to public policy. Behavioral watch. Behavioral watch sort of has two meanings. One is we're watching behavior. For example, you probably can't read the small print, but this box is about how people decide whether to circle the parking lot for an open space, or to stay in one spot, or take the first available spot, which could be very far from the shopping mall. And it's about search theory, but really, I think, driving that home in terms of everyday decisions, the behavior that people make. But once we get to the chapter on behavioral economics, the behavioral watches take on a different flavor, and they focus more on lessons from behavioral economics about how people's behavior may deviate from the standard model, and why that might be the case, and how we can, A, avoid making mistakes, B, understand behavior better. Over on the right, you see pro-con. Every chapter has a pro-con feature. What do I mean by that? Well, I discovered when I worked in the government that when the president asked me about an issue, or the Treasury Secretary, he didn't say, tell me what to do. He said, I'm considering X. Tell me the pros and the cons, and then I'll make a decision. And it turns out that in practice, economists, advisors, people who work in companies, they don't look at an objective function, look at their constraints, and find the optimal point and say, we're going to do this. They're asked for the pros and the cons. They're asked to evaluate what are the reasons for doing it, the reasons against, what are the benefits, what are the costs, how do we weigh them up? People can put different weight on them. So the way that we've organized these pro-con features is that we take an issue which is relevant to the material in the chapter. For example, should we have a carbon tax? And then we discuss the pros and the cons. We ask the student, what would you choose? Why? And we're going to have an online feature where the students can say, I chose this particular option, and here's how I ranked the pros and cons. This is how come I came out where I did. We're also going to have an exercise in every chapter, in the end of chapter questions, where the students will be presented with a little synopsis about an issue and asked to come up with the pros and cons themselves. And also be able to provide that online. We can do it anonymously, and we can tabulate the results, and we could have some fun with this. It could help to enrich the course, make it much more interactive. So let me describe Chapter 13, the Behavioral Economics chapter. It has 3 sections, and it's organized around 8 key ideas from behavioral economics. And you could say, where did I get these 8 key ideas? I asked my colleague Danny Kahneman to tell me the 10 most important things of behavioral economics, and he said there were really only 8. So that's really how I started this list. And there's some overlap between these concepts. What are they? First, and I also want to emphasize this. I think the rational actor model has been extremely valuable in economics, as Jennifer mentioned earlier today. But I think to understand what it means to be rational, if it's anything more than a tautology, we need to understand what deviations from rational decisions are. And one of the things that I think turns students off when they think about economics is that they know from their own experience that decisions are not always rational. People are not always making self-interested decisions. They've seen with their own eyes people make decisions that were against their self-interest, and they, I think, are drawn to other fields in part because they want to understand that. So the behavioral economics chapter, I think, helps in 2 respects. One is it helps students to understand principles of economics much better, because I don't think you can understand what it means to make a rational benefit-cost calculation unless you understand what it means to not make a rational benefit-cost calculation. And then secondly, I think it helps them to avoid mistakes that are part of human nature and are quite common. So what kinds of mistakes? Deviations from rational decision-making. Well, framing. Kahneman and Tversky won a Nobel Prize because they showed that the way a choice is framed affects the decision that people make, whether it's framed in terms of gains or losses. So that's one example. Sunk cost fallacy. Sunk costs, as you know, are not supposed to matter, but people do throw a lot of good money after bad. They do seem to allow sunk costs to affect their subsequent decisions. Impatience. Technically, this is hyperbolic discounting. This is not uncommon to students, and in fact, Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations that young people ignore the long-run costs. They're drawn to the glory of going to war, for example, and they disregard the dangers. They don't think about the long run. And impatience is a big problem, hyperbolic discounting, looking just at kind of the near term and ignoring the long-run consequences. It was a big problem with the financial crisis. People were attracted to mortgages where initial payments were very low and then they ballooned up. That's an example of impatience having real consequences for the economy. Overconfidence. Everybody thinks they're a better driver than average. Everybody thinks they're a better investor than average, especially men. And, of course, it's not the case. So that's a behavioral bias that tends to lead people to make mistakes. and to make some important economic mistakes, for example, with their retirement portfolio. Status quo bias. People tend to stick with the status quo, not to actively consider the benefits and costs in making a change. Loss aversion, which is related to framing, I think, and you can see Kahneman and Tversky's famous graph from prospect theory, that they want to avoid situations where they are at risk of losing money, and they treat losses asymmetrically. Losses count more than gains. The focusing illusion. This was really fascinating discovery by Kahneman and Cicciotti. When people think about a decision, they focus on a few salient aspects of the decision. They don't look at the whole picture. So, for example, if we were to ask you, who's happier, people who live in Minnesota or people who live in California? Well, what's salient? The weather in Minnesota is cold. Weather in California is typically nice. That's what comes to people's minds. And by a wide margin, if you ask people who's happier, people in Minnesota or people in California, they say people in Minnesota. And in fact, there's no difference. If you look at a variety of measures of subjective well-being or some other measures, it doesn't look like there's much difference. And I think the reason is that what affects people's happiness is not the weather, which is what popped to mind, but it's whether they're in a job that they're happy with, whether they have a good relationship with their family, how their children are doing, and so on. It's the day-to-day stresses and frustrations that are much more important for their happiness, but that doesn't get reflected when they think about that question. Likewise, when they buy a car. Car salesmen are really good at this. Think about how wonderful it will be to drive this car, on the highway when you can go 65 miles an hour and the top down and the wind blowing. And most of the time, you're sitting in traffic. And research has found that the value of the car really doesn't have that much to do with the amount of enjoyment people get from the type of car that they buy, which reminds me of another thing. All of these ideas are used in marketing and used against people to induce them to make decisions that might be in the marketer's interest but not necessarily in the consumer's interest. So we try to highlight how these have been used. For example, in The Economist magazine, the opening story to the chapter uses an example from how The Economist magazine framed different options that people could choose from to buy a subscription and how that affected their choices. Then lastly is a desire for reciprocity and fairness. We are social animals. If somebody cuts us off on the road, we don't actually say, I'm going to be empathetic. That person must be in a rush because he's going to the hospital. We want to scream at that person. And what research has found is that if someone is treated unfairly, they will go out of their way. They will impose costs on themselves to punish that other person. Now, in the long run, that might be in society's interest, but in the short run, it's certainly not in a particular individual's interest to impose costs on themselves to punish somebody else where they don't get any benefit from punishing them. So it's not so surprising that when people play games like a division game where they're ultimatum game where they're dividing a sum of money, where the optimal, the way this works is you have a dollar on the table. Player A says, I'll keep 50 cents. Whatever I don't keep, the other player can keep. And it's up to the second player to make a decision about whether they both get what is in the offing or whether they both get nothing. The optimal thing to do is for player A to take 99 cents, leave player B with 1 penny. Player B, 1 penny is better than nothing. And in fact, what happens is people go to 50-50. They tend to go to the middle. Now, with the dollar, you could think, well, that's not big stakes. But this kind of experiment has been done with 6 months' worth of income in developing countries. And you still see that people are going much closer to 50-50, maybe 40%, taking 60 and giving the other side 40, than doing what would be economically in their narrow self-interest, because they understand that people are going to retaliate and that people will turn down an offer that they don't consider to be fair. So that is, I think, the core of behavioral economics. And what the chapter tries to do is to discuss, actually I can show you this next slide, what the mistakes are that people often make, which cause them to deviate from rational decision-making, kind of describes it a little bit more using the technical descriptions from behavioral economics, and then how to avoid making those kinds of mistakes. The next section describes how economists, psychologists, sociologists have tried to measure subjective well-being. Now, if people are utility maximizers, there's not much point in measuring subjective well-being. We can infer it from the choices they make. That's the beauty of revealed preference. But if people make mistakes, then revealed preference can be misleading. And maybe we can learn more from asking people how satisfied they are with their lives, how they experience different activities. So the second section discusses measures of subjective well-being and what's been learned from that literature. And then finally, I call this using behavioral economics for good, for public policy, where we discuss choice architecture, how you can frame a choice so that it's in the person's interest. I'll go into that in more detail in a moment. Nudges are an example of that. You cleverly choose the default. And also internalities. So let me go into a little bit more detail. Here's an example, by the way, of a behavioral watch in this chapter. Now that framing has been introduced, this is a good example because it shows that economists are subject to these behavioral biases. The example is the National Bureau of Economic Research sends out a mailing every week, which many of you are probably on, listing the new working papers over that week. The order of the papers was random. And what Dan Feenberg and his co-authors found was that articles that were listed at the top were 30% more likely to be cited 2 years later, have more impact just because they were at the top of the list. That's an effective framing. It's it's more salient, it's on the top. And because of this study, the NBR has actually changed the way it organizes the list. Not everyone gets the same order. That's more fair to the authors. And I like this. We tell the students where they could get the weekly list of NBR working papers. Policy Watch. Here's an example of a relevant policy that fits in with this material. The Pension Protection Act, which had as one key component encouragement for companies to automatically enroll their employees, their new employees, in tax-preferred savings plans. And I think this is also important. We point out in the box that once the law changed, there actually was an impact of the law. Many laws change and then nothing happens. There's no enforcement. It gets ignored. It's actually remarkable how often laws have very little impact on people's lives. But here's an example where the Pension Protection Act did cause companies to default the employees into the savings plan as opposed to having them take a step to opt into the plan. So now the default is that they're part of the savings plan. And studies have found that when companies have the default that the workers are automatically enrolled in the 401k savings plan, they're much more likely to participate. And then years later, they're much more likely to have saved more for their retirement. Not only that, there's a lot of status quo bias. Once individuals are put into a plan, they tend to just go with what the default plan option is. Could be just buying bonds, could be buying the S&P 500, could be the Vanguard plan. Whatever the default is, most workers don't make an active choice. They tend to stick with the default, which suggests that you want to choose the default plan very carefully. That's one way of using behavioral economics to help people to make better decisions. Here's an example of a pro-con box, and this gives me a chance to define what I mean by internality. You all know what an externality is. Of course, it's when there's a transaction that takes place that has costs or benefits, but usually we think about negative externalities, costs on someone else. An internality occurs when someone makes a decision that imposes costs on him or herself that they weren't aware of or that they didn't fully take into account. So if people are impatient, they discount the future too much, then they might just see the immediate gains, the joy they would get from smoking, without fully accounting for the fact that they could become addicted to smoking and that could be bad for their health down the road, could cause other problems down the road. They don't fully take those costs into account. So there's a big literature. It's controversial. We point out that not everyone interprets the literature the same way, but the way I read it is that many people who start smoking have not made a rational decision. It would have been in their interest not to start smoking. Not true of everyone, but that seems to be the case for many people. One of the reasons why I say that is states that have a higher tax on cigarettes, the group of people who look like they were discouraged from starting to smoke because of that look like they're better off later on than if you compare them to a similar group of people in states with a lower tax on smoking where they are more likely to smoke. So anyway, that's the idea of internality. The way the pro-con box works is it discusses the issue, applies it to cigarette smoking, and then lists pros and cons. And one of the things I learned working in the government is there's kind of a desire to be balanced and have an equal number of pros and cons. Because if you have 6 pros and 1 con, that might lead the president to say, well, there's 6 arguments in favor, 1 against, so I'm going to go with the one with more arguments in favor. Now, I think the president's more sophisticated than that, but that's often the way the staff felt. So we try to have rough balance in terms of the numbers of pros and cons. And you can see them. You probably could think of these yourself. Start with the pros of taxing cigarettes because of the risk of an internality. If people are making mistakes by taking up smoking, then taxing cigarettes could be in their own interest, could make them better off. Discouraging people from smoking will lead to fewer smoking-related diseases and illnesses, such as emphysema and lung cancer. Higher cigarette tax will raise revenue, which could be used for other things like preschool education, which is something that President Obama proposed. In actuality, most of the revenue from sales tax, I was thinking about this when I reread this on the airplane on the way down, goes to campaigns to persuade people to stop smoking. What are the cons? Well, one con is that people learn by making mistakes. The government shouldn't be in the business of preventing people from making mistakes because people aren't going to learn to prevent making mistakes themselves if the government is so paternalistic. Another concern is a tax on cigarettes is more burdensome on the poor. There's a distributional effect, and one might bring up equity concerns. And then the third, which I think is a serious con, is that not everyone is making a mistake. For some, smoking is a rational choice. They're fully aware of the risk of lung cancer down the road, but they feel that they get so much pleasure from smoking that it's in their interest. And there certainly may be some people for whom starting to smoke was a rational choice. And in that case, we're making those people worse off by taxing cigarettes. So at the end of the pro-con box, the students are asked, what would you choose? Why? And then they can provide that information online. And as I mentioned, in each chapter, we make the students do more work, where we give them a little bit of the synopsis of the issue, and then they come up with the pros and cons themselves. Let me next say a little bit about the Evidence Matters chapter. And it's focused on evidence, not on econometrics, not even on kind of raw data, on evidence. What do we mean by evidence in economics? And there are sort of 2 examples running through this chapter. One is the payoff to education, the payoff to going to a high school and finishing high school, going to college, finishing college. What's the economic reward? How do we measure that? Of course, there are potential omitted variables, and we don't know that college causes people to have higher income. How would we make a rational decision? How would we think about getting evidence on what the benefit of going to college is or going to one school over another one? That's one type of example. The second is supply and demand. How do we estimate the supply curve and the demand curve? What we see is the intersection of the 2 curves. We see the equilibrium. So what I love about this chapter, I have to say I'm very excited about this, because I think this really does have the potential to change the way principles is taught to more closely reflect the way economics is done, is it explains some pretty complex econometric ideas like correlation, causality, simultaneous equations without any math at all. It gives the intuition for how one could separately identify the supply curve from the demand curve. If you have shifts in demand, what you do is you trace out the supply curve. And it reinforces what students learn in every introductory course, which is supply and demand. They learn those tools, but they have no idea how to actually use them. And they have no idea about magnitudes because it's just presented to them that this is how the economy works, without thinking about, well, is this a big response or a little response? And should I really care about the response because it's big or small? This gives them a framework for addressing those questions and for thinking about how they would gather evidence. Generating evidence. There's a section there about data. Now, it's not so boring as this is about data. It's about the major data series that flow into economists. And anyone has access now from anywhere on a computer to a remarkable amount of data from the census, from the current population survey, from the PSID or the SIP, or internationally from the OECD, from Bureau of Economic Analysis, and so on. So we talk about where the data comes from, generating evidence. And we also talk about not only generating the data, but thinking about how are we going to determine whether this is a causal effect. You could have a randomized experiment. You can have natural experiment. And it gives some examples which kind of connect to the rest of the book on how to think about those issues. And as I said, there's not one equation until you get to the appendix, which uses the starting lineup from the San Francisco Giants to look at the relationship between batting average and salary and explain correlation, for the students who want to. They don't have to. I actually don't think it's necessary for freshmen or sophomores to see how a mean or median is calculated. Certainly not a correlation coefficient, but if they want to, that's in the appendix. So the data watch here describes several of the key data sets that economists use. History watch. Oh, I should have mentioned, supply and demand is taught in this chapter talking about oil. Because gasoline is on many students' minds, since many of them, fewer than used to, but many of them have cars. And there's been such dramatic movements in the price of oil, which affects many other commodities, such as cost of rubber or plastic. So this series on the left is the price of a barrel of oil. And throughout the book, we incorporate Fred. And I was pleased to see that you had a whole session on teaching with Fred earlier in this conference. We have Fred graphs in the book to make it more approachable. We explain how to get the data and update it yourself on Fred. And here's a history box describing, we see this big drop in the price of oil. There's a lot of discussion in the chapter on whether that came about because supply curve shifted to the right or because demand shifted to the left. The box discusses the big increase in oil coming because of fracking in the U.S., some of the disruptions that occurred in other parts of the world to get students to think about how they should interpret evidence. Let me lastly, and I'm sure you're very hungry since I'm starting to hear my stomach growl, say a little bit about macroeconomics. I asked John Shea, who is a macroeconomist and is primarily responsible for the macro chapters, what makes our book distinctive? And he said 3 areas: evidence, policy, and relevance, which is a theme running throughout the book. I think that's the way I would really say what makes the whole book distinctive. So on the evidence front, we connect both micro and macro aggregate evidence to discuss key insights from macroeconomics. A really good example is my colleague Atif Mian and Amir Sufi's work on how the housing crisis affected consumption and employment across different areas of the U.S. the history watches help to connect sort of core Keynesian aggregate demand ideas with very important historical episodes in macroeconomics, such as the Great Depression, the Great Recession, the Great Inflation, and then the Volcker disinflation. And as I said, we try to make it as easy as possible for the students to get online, get the data from Fred, update the charts that are in the book, and think for themselves, interpret the data themselves. In terms of policy, there are lots of opportunities. And the fact that John and I sort of both lived through the response to the Great Recession, I think, really makes this come alive. It certainly makes me relive some of it. We talk about what happened to aggregate demand during the Great Recession, consequences of high national debt. The pro-cons are related to actual issues that were being debated, and a key one, which will be ongoing, is the pace that the Federal Reserve should tighten. What should it do with its portfolio? And then let me end by saying, I think what's sort of key about our approach is we want to teach economics the way that economics is done in practice. That's why the evidence matters so much. That's also an organizing principle for macroeconomics. How is it that policymakers are using macroeconomics to make decisions? What are the models that they're using? So there are sort of four distinctive elements here. We replace the traditional money demand and supply liquidity preference with a model of credit supply and demand. And that connects much more directly with the nature of the financial crisis. We model the systematic part of the Fed's decision-making process using an interest rate rule, namely the Taylor rule. We present aggregate demand, aggregate supply with inflation on the axis, not the price level. Makes a lot of sense since throughout most of American history we've not had deflation. We still don't have deflation. Also, I think it accords with the way that policymakers are thinking about decisions. And then lastly, as I've emphasized, we focus on contemporary examples, the Great Recession, the rise of China, what the Federal Reserve should do given that it now has a $4 trillion balance sheet. So I'm very excited, as you could probably tell. I think the introductory course is a gateway into the field. As Betsy mentioned, most students are not going to become practicing economists, but we want them to leave with the lessons that they could use to make better decisions throughout life. And I think that our approach is going to help facilitate that. So hopefully I left some time for some questions before lunch.